Well, thanks for coming out. A lot of folks I hadn't seen for a while. For folks that don't know me, I was born and raised in Greenville. I graduated in the class of 1974. Which I think we did determine in high school this morning was probably the biggest class that graduated from Greenville. I went on to Notre Dame, but I was already a strong space. That up pretty much in the late elementary, junior high, as I was a kid of Apollo. I was 13 when we landed on it, and decided that that's what I wanted to go do. Went to Notre Dame to get an aerospace engineering degree, and then just out of mostly luck, met a NASA engineer with gave me connections to get started, and ended up right out of college going to the Johnson Space Center. And spent 10 years at NASA Johnson. Moved to the Washington D.C. That's where NASA headquarters is, but we had a special office for the space station program. Did that, worked at NASA headquarters. Retired from NASA in 2011 after 33 years, and moved to Lockheed Martin. And after 3 years, despite the fact that in my interview I had said I do not want to go to Houston, I do not want to go to Alabama, I just want to go to Florida, they said, well, we really do believe that you want to go to Houston. So for the last 8+ years, I've been commuting between Virginia and Houston. But that's because they asked me to go build spaceships, and for a space cadet, that's pretty tough to turn down. So I want to talk a little bit about that and tell you a little bit about my spaceship, which is called Orion, but it's part of what NASA calls overall the Artemis program. Artemis is Apollo's sister. So this is a somewhat akin program to Apollo. It's a return back to the moon. Why would we go back to? Why would we explore it? I ask questions. You have to prepare. You need some answers. So why would we explore space anyway? Science. Well, but what science? Creativity.
Some of the things that were made for the space program have been very useful in everyday society. I, as a dentist, worked with whipping wire. Whipping wire totally revolutionized orthodontics. Orthodontics used to take 3 to 4 years, and now with whipping wire, which
I have that discussion with my dentist every time I can see it.
There are resources in space.
There are resources that we need, but there's bigger picture learning. I think of it in 3 really big ones. When you look at just the distribution of elements across the solar system, the elements that make us more prevalent, you may already be. Where are we going? You look at Earth and this nice little cozy zone to the sun. Venus is a hot mess. Mars is a very desolate place, but it looks like it used to have an atmosphere. It looks like it used to have abundant water. So where are we going? And then the other question is,
Mike, could I ask you to speak a little louder?
okay. So the third piece is, aren't we alone? And one of the things, I remember being taught in biology that life was this really 1 in a billion occurrence that's fortunately happened. Here, past few decades, we got to learn that life is really, really great. And there's something with the problem. That's inside nuclear reactors, it's deep in Siberian and Arctic lakes. Burrow down and you actually find it. So life is very hard. So we really believe we're on. Those are the big things that drive exploration. And then we talk about mega. And there's a lot of folks that do, well, Apollo did that already. We all have t-shirts, that's okay. You don't need to do. But what have we learned since Apollo? Well, one, water. Just talked about the fact that where there's water and energy, there can be fire.
communication device. So we really believe that there's a lot of water bound up in the craters that never actually see. And that water can be used for water, it can be used for oxygen, and it can be used for hydrogen and oxygen. Actually, use the resources on to continue exploration. Back part of a lot of spacecraft that we have a couple decades. Totally new. So NASA set a goal to go back to the moon. The other thing that we like to talk about is it's a lot more convenient to develop your exploration capabilities and you're just a 3-day trip away from home than when you're 6-month to year trip. So it makes sense.
NASA started, it was really in the early 2000s, NASA decided to pursue a new moon program. And that was, it was kind of in the idea that we really want to focus not just around the Earth. That's more now of a commercial business, and we've seen that develop with folks like SpaceX and others that are launching satellites. They've taken over much of the launching of this country. We'll focus NASA on further out, and that translated into the moon and onto Mars. And so right now, NASA actually has a Moon to Mars program, and Artemis became the moon aspect of that. So let's look at more pictures. Dean didn't trust me to find Flickr like they did.
It's not going page by page, so that's part of the problem.
So obviously the stuff that we have when we went to Apollo doesn't exist. So it's museum pieces, and the technology it would take to do it is totally different with the technology that we have today. Even stuff that we shape from the shuttle, we've learned that some of that stuff is not even usable anymore. So we built a big new rocket akin to a Saturn V rocket. It's called the Space Launch System, but you can see there are aspects of it that use shuttle heritage. Those big boosters on the side actually are just a stretched version of a shuttle booster. The engines underneath are actually the big engines from the shuttle that are on the back of the shuttle orbiters. And then at the very, very tiny top is my little Orion capsule, which is in the next picture. So the spacecraft, very similar to Apollo. I kind of joked that, you know, while we build it all very differently, the shape is right. The Apollo gang got that right. If you're coming back from the moon at a very high speed re-entry in the atmosphere, that kind of gumdrop shape is what you want. And so, similar base. My Lockheed Martin job, we built that capsule. We built the big ring that were all the interfaces to the capsule, but in a separate deal, NASA asked the European Space Agency to build the lower part of the service module. So that's a European service module, and that actually comes from Bremen, Germany, and a bunch of European countries. But my team works with the Airbus team in Bremen, Germany, and I've spent a lot of time in Germany the last few years. Ultimately, we need landing systems because Orion doesn't land. It's an orbiting spacecraft. NASA has a contract for the first lander with SpaceX. Then they have a competition for a follow-on lander that's going on right now. You will need all kinds of tools. We kind of remember about Apollo. We remember tools that crew built. You know, they pulled little golf carts behind them. They had rovers. So all of those things you need to recreate. But even though the shape is similar, like the crew module, everything about how you get there is different. How we engineer is different. How we manufacture is different because it's all digital. Of course, I would be clueless still with my slide roll, but now engineers, everything is designed in CAD systems on computers. It's sent to automated milling equipment and manufactured digitally and then assembled and tested, but even out with strong use of different tools. So we just don't build anything like we did in the Apollo era. We use some of the same materials, but even those have changed, like the base of the heat shield. The half-coat material was manufactured for Apollo, but then it was remanufactured because, of course, it had things in it that are carcinogens. And now you can't manufacture those chemicals, so the new half-coat is a slightly different formula than we licensed from Textron, the original manufacturer, to make heat shields. NASA is planning for a small space station around the moon, they call it Gateway. And ultimately, their plan is you won't build another really big ship and launch it from Earth to go to Mars. You're going to build it in pieces out around the moon, around this gateway. And you're going to go to the moon or go to Mars from the moon. You will need, we have had to redo the Florida ground systems. So a lot of the things that we had, even to redoing the, the big mobile launch trailer that takes the rockets out to the pad, we will be building rovers. The Lockheed Martin team actually has a partnership with GM. GM actually built the rovers for the Apollo program. We do these spaces, and that will allow us to establish a base on the moon that will do all the things we talked about. We'll learn how to use the water, we'll learn how to use the resources there, and we'll learn how to develop techniques that will ultimately take us onto Mars. Why do we care about Mars? The big questions that I talked about at the beginning. Mars may very likely have had life at one point in its existence. But we definitely know it had water. We know that it has ice today. NASA sent a lander to one of the poles looking for ice. Lockheed Martin built the lander, so I have all the backstories on it. Literally, when they turned the camera on and pointed it down to the surface, it was sitting on ice. So pretty good targeting. So next, you can ask questions along the way, please. So just a little bit about the rocket space launch system. There was a point in 2010 where the administration said, pause all this new exploration stuff. We need to rethink it and reformulate it. Out of that time frame came this kind of innocuous acronym of the Space Launch System. It was actually what it was called in the Senate bill that kind of captured the exploration program at that point in time. And in other stories, I can tell you how Senate bills get written in Irish pubs. Near the Capitol buildings in DC. Next, please. So, like I said, the boosters were actually heritage boosters from shuttle, but they're stretched to full reserve. The shuttle boosters, we can call them 4 segments of propellant stacked together. This is fine. And so they produce about 3 million pounds of force each. The engines on the bottom, there's 4 instead of 3 that the shuttle used. Unfortunately, we don't reclaim those. Shuttle, we reused them, and the first flight used several veteran engines for the shuttle program.
Are they solid propellant?
The big boosters are solid, the engines are liquid. So the tank is liquid hydrogen, liquid oxygen tank. And so similar to the shuttle, which had a propellant system like that. That's one of the toughest things we learned launching this piece this year, was fueling a tank much larger than anything we've ever done with the hydrogen and oxygen. And then we need an upper stage to get actually from Earth orbit out to the moon. So that stage for this rocket was provided by another booster that the US has that is stable. It's called the Delta IV Heavy. It launches big satellites, things that look over other people and see things. Those big satellites use that big booster. So we use the upper stage for that. Of local note, I'm not sure if they still do, but for years, the white paint on the boosters came from Jamestown Paint. Yeah, and I don't know if the new ones do, because they actually, every time I ask down north of Drummond, They have a hard time figuring out because they actually buy it through vendors. But if they trace it long enough, they say, oh yeah, that Jamestown company you asked about, yeah. Next. So just to give you a sense of the size, in terms of the space shuttle that we're used to seeing, I'm blocking it, right?
No.
And all the way up to the next version of the booster, we launched on the one in the middle in November. And so what we're calling Block 2 actually adds a new upper stage, which is quite a bit bigger. And that's what's going to take not only Orion, but we'll be able to take like another lab module or habitation module with us inside that shroud, similar to the way Apollo carried the lander that way. And then compared to the Saturn V, all of the footprint in Florida was actually built to the Saturn V, but Von Braun actually already had in his model a bigger booster than that called Nova. And so all the infrastructure in Florida was actually built towards Nova. That never happened after the end of the Apollo program.
Was Saturn V unusable for Orion?
We lost all that capability. You know, the last 3 Saturn V's are museum pieces across the country. And again, when you would go back and look at retooling or remanufacturing, you would be inventing from scratch anyway. Really? Yeah. It's just we took some of the upper stage engines and tried to do that, but even that was a very expensive process to redo the engines, retest them. Because you had made this big jump in technology with the shuttle program, so you had to go too far back. Really, is what the answer was.
It was obsolete.
It was obsolete, and every way it was obsolete, and in a way that today's engineering techniques and processes couldn't make use of it. You'd have to go back and you would literally, to be able to do all the interfaces and stuff the way we do today, you would have to go in and digitize that entire stack. Because otherwise you couldn't do the work that you need to do just to meet up with it. Next. Okay, now we'll talk Orion. Next, please. So, if you remember the space shuttle never had an escape tower. Apollo had an escape tower. Shuttle didn't. The view was that it would fly itself back to Florida. If something happened early in the launch sequence. Reality was we never had to do that. We never had a case where it would have helped us. Obviously, Challenger was a launch accident, but it would not have helped us in that situation. So after the Columbia accident, NASA actually stated that the next human system had to be 10 times safer on launch than the shuttle was. And we get that with this escape tower. That's why we have an escape tower. It will pull the capsule off, and we did 2 tests to demonstrate that. One from the ground and one from about 70 seconds into flight. That actually demonstrated the tower pulls it off, orients it, pops the tower off, and then the parachutes open on the capsule and bring it back down into the water. Your crew capsule is a little bit bigger than Apollo, but like I said, it's the same shape. Physics of that is still the same physics. But all the systems are new. Everything is designed differently. Everything is manufactured differently. On the side, you can kind of see the outline of tiles. Those are the same shuttle tiles that were used on the base of the shuttle. And then the big ring, which is the adapter, mates to the crew module, to the European section of the service module. And that's all the solar arrays for electrical power, gases for breathing, water, all of those consumables that we use on orbit are in that service module. So that's why it's a really critical piece. And that was a really big deal internationally for NASA and the European Space Agency, because NASA has lots of international partnerships, but they have never put a partner, except for the Russians on the space station, in the critical path of how we're going to get to mission success. So for the Europeans, this was a really big thing.
Anything from China?
No.
Good.
NASA is prohibited from dealing with China on a one-on-one basis. And that's because the Chinese were so stupid when they're actually really smart. But when my former Congressman Frank Wolf, who heads the NASA at the time headed NASA's appropriation committee, went to China, they hacked his laptop. Not a really right move for the guy that already is trying to legislate against you. And so for the last 10, 15 years, NASA has had in their appropriation bill, meaning money they spend, you are not allowed to deal with China. At some point, there will probably be some joint. Now, I lived through the bringing the Russians into the program, and that was actually a huge deal. And I think probably much more financially, it was lucrative for the Russians, but knowledge of what was really going on was huge for the US. Because we were in all of the Russian plants all the time that had been developing stuff against us for decades.
Now, that crew module, is that for 2 astronauts or 4?
It's actually for 4. So when it flies next, which will be a little under 2 years, it'll have 4 crew. And they've already stated that that's probably 3 Americans and a Canadian. And first woman, probably first man of color. That's to be named. But it is a fact of life that, you know, all astronauts were military test pilots that were all white and all about the same size.
How involved is the Space Force with your project?
So the NASA and the Space Force share a lot of activities together, and they do a lot of technology development work together, but they don't do anything explicitly on the spacecraft. They do provide tracking information, they provide radar information, but they don't do anything explicit on the spacecraft itself. Okay, next page. And then the ground system, I talked a little bit about this. Oh, it was heritage of Apollo, updated a little bit for shuttle, but really had to be redone. You look at the space shuttle, and then you look at that big stack of the space launch system, and that means inside the big vertical assembly building, every work platform has to be different places. Because you need everything up against the rocket as you're actually doing work. Next. So just some nice shots of the vehicle and rolling out to the pad. It was fun to watch it roll out for the first time. You know, you really got a sense of how big it was when it passed under the door, and there wasn't that much room to go to the door. But the first time that a rocket meant to go out to the moon had been out of that building since 1972, the last Apollo mission. Next. We also actually flew some stuff inside. So what do we need to learn? One of the things we need to learn is more about the effects on the human body. We know radiation is different around the moon. We're actually in a little cocoon here on Earth with the Van Allen belts. But once you get out past that, not only do you see effects on the body, but you also see effects on your computers, all your electronics. We designed that part of it out for, you know, computers that can restart and reset themselves. A little tougher to do that with the humans, so you need to understand the environment. We did that both on the dosimeters and on this Mari experiment. We actually flew 2 dummy torsos with sensors. And one of them was wrapped in a vest made by an Israeli company, actually made for nuclear industry employees. But you know, wrapped the vest to see how well the vest actually mitigated the radiation impact. So those have been delivered back to their owners. The other one I want to hit on is just a little bit. NASA made us invent this name of crew interface technology payload for some reason. It had to be a technology payload. The fact that it was just a really fun part of the mission was hard to deal with. We wanted to demonstrate voice assisted technology. So we actually called this payload Callisto. Callisto was one of the hunting handmaidens of Artemis. But we flew Alexa. Actually, we built a space Alexa and flew her and an iPad and Cisco WebEx software on board the spaceship. So for mission control, we could have folks come in and out of mission control and ask Alexa questions, just like a crew would ask Alexa questions like, well, can you find me that drawing? So we displayed telemetry on, that's an iPad that's buried behind the blue cover. And it actually works great. We had folks coming in and out of mission control to do it all through the mission. It was very popular, but several people came in and said, yeah, we get it. You know, we're now more and more all accustomed to having Alexa turn our lights on and do whatever. And we really do view that's going to be part of the future of flying in space. So Alexa had a great first mission. We'll see how we can carry it on. Next. So what are the big things that we needed to prove? First off was just the rocket. First flight of the rocket, even though it had heritage parts, first flight of this brand new integrated system, it was really hard to launch this rocket. We had a couple different, what we call wet dress rehearsals, which means you fuel the entire rocket, you try to get as close as you can to launch, you don't launch. But it took us several times to even get through all of that. Hydrogen is really hard. Liquid hydrogen is like minus 450 degrees. And it's a really, really, really tiny molecule. It doesn't like to stay in anything, even metal tanks. So it tends to leak in valves, and that's what was happening to us. But so we had to get that. And for Orion, we wanted to spend as much time as we could out around the moon to see how the spacecraft operated in that environment. The Apollo missions, they did some precursor uncrewed missions, but they did them around the Earth. So a lot of things I still hang with a couple of the Apollo crowd occasionally because they like to go drink beer too. And but they were saying what you folks are doing is way more aggressive than what Apollo did, because you're taking all of that risk and you're doing it at the moon the very first time. But the mission worked great. We also need to demonstrate the heat shield, because it's a much tougher problem coming back from the moon than it is coming back from the space station. Space station, you know, the shuttle used those tiles, but that doesn't cut it through. That's why we went back to the Apollo material called AFCO on the base of the spacecraft, because that handles over 5,000 degrees coming into the atmosphere. The shuttle would only handle about 3,000. And getting the capsule back was important, for seeing how heat shield worked. But also to save money, years and years ago, probably before my time, we had made the trade with NASA to reuse some of the flight gears. And so we needed to get them back from Artemis 1 to be able to put them into Artemis 2 and hold the Artemis 2 schedule. So we got all that back. That has worked. Next, please. So this is a really confusing diagram, but it shows a couple things. We launched from Florida. We go out to the moon, and a little different than Apollo, we actually dipped close to the moon to put us in this big orbit.
I'm not sure I understand.
I don't either, but on the robotic missions that NASA does, they do this gravity assist maneuver all the time, but we hadn't used that in the human programs. So we used the moon's gravity to help whip us into this big orbit. And the goal of the orbit is because it's actually a low energy orbit. It doesn't take a bunch of propellant to keep you in that orbit. But it's a long loop. That's about a 9-day loop. And so we did it going in, and then we did it coming back out here to get back to Earth. And because of that, it took a little bit longer. You know, you probably remember Apollo missions were like 3 days off to the moon. We actually took 9 to get there and spent about that much in the orbit and then back. So the total mission was 25.5 days, which gave us a ton of time around the moon, which from an engineering standpoint was really, really helpful. In fact, the spacecraft behaved so well, we were making it up as a little bit harsh, but we pulsed the team and said, are there other tests that you would like to do? Because things aren't failing. It's really quiet. So we actually added 20 different tests to the mission once we had launched, just because things were going so smoothly. Next. And so this again just talks about what was it that we were really trying to learn in the mission, and we really had a lot of time to add extra things. We also added a whole bunch of Callisto sessions too, which NASA at first was really kind of, they don't know how to deal with some of these commercial things. The idea that they were dealing with the big Amazon blog and Alexa made them nervous. But then about 4 days in, they're like, well, can we have more sessions with Callisto and people come and talk? So we added that to it. Next. So, one of my, Apollo buddies that I still see once in a while, there's a guy by the name of Ed Fendel, and his Apollo nickname was Captain Video, because he ran all the TV systems on the moon. And he sent me an email saying, you know, where did you get those great cameras? I would have killed for cameras like that. And I didn't have the heart to tell him. Those are GoPro cameras. That's a little bit ruggedized GoPro Hero camera that we talked the Europeans into mounting on the tips of the solar. They wanted them for the engineering data of, you know, how the solar rays are influence. Because, you know, we knew that we were going to get the scenes of the moon, the Apollo 8, Earthrise coming up above the moon. And there's a couple other great shots in here of, you know, just the Orion with the moon in the foreground and Earth in the background. And so the cameras worked great. And I'm stunned that they did, because it's really hard to take an off-the-shelf piece and have it work after being shaken like crazy, going up into space and dealing with the radiation environment. And but we really got some great images. Next thing. So this is one I really like. That Orion actually went further than any human spacecraft has traveled. The record before Orion was Apollo 13. After the accident, they had to do a big loop around the moon to come back. And we actually surpassed that by several miles. And this picture was taken around that time of the farthest distance. Next sheet. And then just kind of encapsulating a few others, you get the launch, you get on orbit, and then you get the splash down in the Pacific. We splashed down, you know, that's some of us remember Apollo, and it seemed like we were kind of lucky if we were near the ship. That life has changed. You know, we actually typically target within a mile or two of the ship. So the Navy divers are there really quickly to get the capsule, and ultimately they'll get the crew out. Right now, the capsule is towed into what's called a well deck ship. Literally, the ship opens, you bring the capsule in, close the door, evacuate the water, and the ship sits there. It's an interesting technique, maybe not the best. Maybe going back to a crane on an aircraft carrier or pulling it out of the water would be smarter. We'll see. Because it's that time when you're in the well deck and the doors aren't shut. You have a lot of wave action in a tiny enclosed space, and the capsule needs to bounce around a lot more than somebody who just built that capsule would like to see it do. So we're going to see if that's going to change. And I think, is that it, Dean? I think that's the last picture. No, and this is just showing the Navy team going in and getting all the cables lined up, and then literally it's just pulled into the ship.
Is it reusable?
So the capsule is largely reusable. So all the interior stuff that I talked about, the flight computers, various avionics units, those are reusable. The crew seats, all of that are all reusable. The structure is reusable. We have, if I showed you how that was manufactured, you'd actually see that it's a slope side and then it's a straight cylinder. But it ends up as a true gumdrop, and that's because around the outside, covered by those tiles, are things like your propulsion thrusters, your tanks, and all those kinds of things. Well, those are exposed to solvent. So we have a raging debate. In this case, we is Lockheed Martin. I never know who we is when I'm talking. But so Lockheed Martin and NASA are debating, can we just reuse equipment that's seen solvent? Are there cables that degrade? Are there fittings that degrade? So that's one of the things that's also really important about this mission, is getting the capsule in shape, getting it cleaned off, and assessing how much that we got. We did a test flight, but we didn't know really about this phenomenon so much. So, you know, we launched the one-day mission in December. we drove back to Florida, let it sit over the holidays, opened it up, took the heat shield off and found 500 gallons of water. Solid water. And so
Yes.
obviously we had not gone out of our way to protect against that hazard. So this mission is really important to see.
Why don't we land on, solid ground like kind of like the Russians do?
So that's a great question, and we did all kinds of trade studies. You have to protect to land in the water on launch anyway, because you're launching out over the ocean, so you have to be able to have something that lands you in the water safely. All of the designs that we looked at with like a balloon system, like Boeing uses a balloon system for their cruise and space station system. SpaceX does not. SpaceX lands in the water. The Russians land on the land with that because they control a lot of land, but they don't really. They couldn't precisely target bodies of water that they could. So, and they land in the middle of the steppes of Kazakhstan, which is pretty low population out in the middle of nowhere. Trust me. I haven't been to landings, I've been to launches, and it's still pretty remote. So if you have a landing bag system, you're gonna carry that all the way to the moon and back. And so you want to give up that mass.
Right.
It's all about mass. And it's, if you wanna, some scientists can put it as bluntly as you want balloons or you want rocks. So that's where the trade ended up with Orion. It could end up in different places for different vehicles.
We have systems now that are landing in Texas.
They're starting to show their landing in Texas. The main one, Bezos, is suborbital, so it just goes up to around 60 miles and lands. If you look at SpaceX Crew, they land in the water coming back from the space station. Now he captures his boosters on barges or on balloons. So I would say it is yet a developing technology. It's not that we don't know how to do it, but depending on what your total mission is, it doesn't end up necessarily being the best trade. And typically for these kinds of things, mass is king. And it's the most expensive thing that you're gonna do. Yes.
I read somewhere in the just folk tales, when the Saturn would take off, it actually would move the Earth in its orbit by something like an inch or something like that. Is that true? That it was so powerful that it actually moved around a bit?
I have no idea. I've never heard it. I mean, Saturn was 7.5 million pounds. We just launched 8.8 million pounds.
So wasn't Saturn or ICBM?
The early technical underpinnings were ICBMs. Because if you look at the history of the von Braun team coming from Germany and being married to the Army, that's where several of the early ICBMs came. And it was kind of a race between the Army and the Navy as to who was really building the ICBMs in that era. Because Mercury was an ICBM very early, and Atlas was the early ICBM in that era, and those were our first two Mercury launch vehicles.
So our new system has no military contribution.
So the one of the games in developing technology on the government side is who has to pay for it. So up until probably November, the DoD would say the Space Launch System has no military applications. Now that it's unlikely they would have to pay for the development of it, they might say, well, actually, we do have things about the size of 3 school buses that we would like to launch. So that's the way that I've watched that game play out over the years. There are folks that will say, yes, indeed, we have things that big that we think that'd be a great launch vehicle. The other thing that SLS could do is the NASA planetary missions. It's not so much for extra mass, but you would have so much more propellant. Now it takes us several years. Like I think it took 9 years to get out to Greenville. You can now do that in 3 or 4 years with a bigger booster. So yeah, the military connections with NASA are very entertaining. I've been in the middle of those a bit myself.
Mike, did you say 2 years, you'd be about 2 years before you're putting man back on the moon?
Well, that'll be the orbital mission and then another year to do the landing mission.
And how long will it be there? Do you know?
The landing mission will likely just be there for, a touchdown and a couple days. Sorting. NASA's still defining what those mission requirements are gonna be.
And they look forward to how long it will be before they try a mission to Mars.
So, they have, and Lockheed Martin has, because, we're also kind of the Mars company. Lockheed Martin builds all of the stationary landers for NASA on Mars. We build all the orbiters around Mars, and we build what are called the aeroshells, the heat shields and the parachute systems and stuff that can drop all the rovers. Jet Propulsion Lab builds the rovers. So we're pretty vested in the whole Mars business. And when you look at Mars opportunities happen roughly every 2 years. So you would want to target probably 2033, 2035 to have the development time to scale up the systems. But we think, a little bit like Tinker Toys, take Orion, you build a habitation module, you've got a couple of folks building habitation modules for that gateway. You put habitation modules with Orion, you put more propulsion, and you're ready to go out to Mars in a few years. Because now you've got.
You have people volunteering to be there.
There will be no shortage of people volunteering to go to Mars.
How long are you gonna be gone?
So, well, Mars, it takes about 6 months to get there right now with the chemical propulsion that we have. And you want to hit the right window for coming back, otherwise it's going to take you much longer to come back. And that window says you either stay for about a month or you stay for a year. So, you have to figure out what mission are you signing up for? Are you doing the short term or are you doing the long term? And then it takes about 3 months to get back.
What about the new nuclear
So
engine they're talking about?
nuclear has come back to the fold. We've been pushing it quite a bit in terms of Mars. We've actually been talking surface nuclear power for the moon as well. We in this is Lockheed Martin, to find myself. Nuclear can certainly change the game. But since it's a technology we understand, but we haven't built systems since the early 70s.
Is it faster and later, or is it?
Faster and later, because you can do continuous thrust, as opposed to, individual engine burns with the chemical propellant. So continuous thrust, even though it's smaller thrust level, still over time integrates to a much larger force. It gets you there faster.
With all the letters that you've spoken about, your SLS and so on, every time I turn my TV on, I'm hearing AI. And I'm just wondering how different the world is going to be in the next 6 months because of AI, and yet you're now suggesting we're going to put 4 human beings for some reason in these capsules and fly them off to space when AI looks like in the next year is going to be unbelievable.
I don't believe it's going to get us there in the next year. We have tried to use AI tools so far, really just on data analysis and reduction. Orion generates probably 20,000 data measurements constantly. And so we've used some AI engines to just review all that data. Look at all the temperatures, see if they fluctuate. Do they fluctuate, this much or that much? And so far, the tools are not where the press is telling us the tools.
But how does a human being bring us to that? What is the difference in the machine if the AI is running it or?
The human being is still the most efficient machine. It's still way past AI. Just as an example, one of the Mars missions, the principal investigator was talking to a group of people he mentioned that, they were gonna go out to, they call them dirt yards, you know, the simulated Mars. And have the rovers go through the plan for the day, and he had his geology students from Cornell out ready to help. Well, the rovers broke, they wouldn't run that thing. So to not waste time, he had his students mark out and do what the rovers would have done. It took them 35 minutes. It would have been an entire 8-hour day for the rovers. So there will be a marriage of AI and humans coming, but I don't believe it's this close yet. And it will change the way all of this is done in a pretty profound way, but we're getting great progress so far. But like I said, I've tried to use it on the spacecraft, and it's not yet a helpful tool.
Anything, in development about the long-term bad effects on the human body about no?
Lots of things in development. You see NASA talking about, flying crew for over a year, and such, and a lot of that is going towards how do you, figure out some of them we have handled. So we have radiation effects, we have loss of muscle and loss of bone. Turns out loss of muscle and loss of bone can be nearly totally arrested by the equivalent of weight training in order. Early programs, even on shuttle, all we did was cardio. It was a treadmill, it was a bike. We actually learned on the space station that the equivalent of weightlifting, resistance training, has in some crew totally arrested bone and muscle mass. But they have since discovered an interocular pressure issue. Yeah, they have not really figured out it affects a fairly decent percentage of crew. And it's also one that doesn't correct. Everything else they can correct back on the earth with physical therapy and training. But that one, there's still some. When they flew Scott Kelly, it was a really unique opportunity because he has an identical twin. And so researchers, actually, they signed up for the twins study. Because Mark could be the control. They had both flown multiple space flights. Mark stayed on the ground. Scott spent almost a year in space, and they literally compared genomes of the two brothers through that study. So it'll be interesting to see. Unfortunately, a lot of that stuff takes forever to get published, right? Because that's the way the science process works. Is it takes time to get everything published and out in the opens.
So is the long-term plan then to have the habitation in orbit around the moon, have people in orbit around the moon or living on the moon? Or being
For the
stationed
moon,
on the moon?
it's really more living on the moon.
Okay.
That the advantage of the gateway is it gives you a point to bring everything together. And then move from there or even move from the surface to there. And so it also, there are more stringent requirements for systems that NASA calls human rated. And so, like with the architecture they have right now, Orion is human rated, it gets the crew out. Other systems don't have to be human rated until they're integrated into the whole stack. And so that saves some of the challenges of those systems. So far, you're beating the physics class for questions.
So the way the space is being militarized, and with all the space debris up there, I mean, does that complicate your mission now?
Hugely.
Yeah.
Yeah, space debris is actually the biggest risk on Earth. And it's only for that time that we're close to the Earth. Space debris is made up of two pieces. Natural, which we call micrometeoroids, and debris, which is human-created space junk. Parts of spacecraft, paint flex. Stuff that astronauts have let go. It's, there's a camera.
The Chinese just disintegrated one of their satellites.
Yes.
There's all that.
Yes, they did a similar thing back in 2007 that created thousands of new pieces of debris. We treat debris. Personal pet peeve, I used to fund the NASA debris program, so. You build shields on your spacecraft against it. You have to track as much as you can, and that's where the Space Force does the tracking. So, and they can track to about a softball. So yeah, you can avoid big chunks, but the littler stuff you have to just protect against, because if the Space Force tells us something is coming in right like space station, they'll say you're gonna have a close encounter. They define a 5 kilometer box around the space station. And they say it's likely to be at this point in space station. NASA has to make the choice of whether to move or.
I mean, kinetic energy, it doesn't matter the size, it could be a grain of sand, but
It's
it
very tiny and it makes big,
makes a big hole.
yeah. One of the theories early on in a space station is that you could take a hit and it would literally unzip the canister that you have on it. We actually physically changed the design at that point in time and made a hull thicker, so they're less vulnerable to that. But yeah, it's a big problem. And we don't yet have systems that will go and capture that. You'll read more about that. Now too, folks, developing a system is actually go and capture that debris, just to clear out the neighborhood.
Yeah.
Frankly. And Russia did an ASAT test just a couple of years ago too. Now we did one too, just to show we were in the club, but we did one much lower, so it entered the atmosphere more quickly. It's a big part of the risk of the business.
Do we have a new design for a lunar landing craft when you're gonna?
So right now, SpaceX is doing a design for a lander that's based on their Starship design. There's another competition, I know that we've got Lockheed Martin folks working on it. We were on a team with Blue Origin, Bezos' company, initially, and we're still on that team, looking at a follow-on lander. So the first one has to be there for 2024. That's their goal for the first landing. And folks will give you varying odds of how that's going. So we'll see. But so the lander's a separate development. Okay. Under an hour.
Okay.
You said you had a hard question. Yes.
I think she said big sister.
Oh, okay. So interesting. I have a question. So it's been umpteen years since the fall, right? And so we went back to the moon. Did you find anything that has changed, like from the data that you had back on the follow up? Like you like blew your mind.
The big thing is finding. The other thing that we
But
have,
did you know that already?
No.
Oh, okay.
Apollo didn't see any signs of it.
Okay.
But the other thing that's kind of interesting is how much of the moon did Apollo really study
Yeah.
from a human walking rover kind of aspect. So if you think of Washington DC, the National Mall between the Capitol and Lincoln, that's about as much as Apollo investigated. So to say that, you know, we figured this little planetoid out, we got it now.
Right.
That's a little bit of an extreme claim with that level of coverage.
So what changed now that they're, you know, saying UFOs do occur and, you know, I mean, what?
You know, I have not jumped into the UFO debate, I'll be honest with you. All of a sudden.
I mean, you guys would say if anybody did.
It's having a great bet. To Ramsey's class, yeah. But yeah, who knows? I'm still waiting for the Star Trek answer. When we achieve warp drive, then the aliens reveal themselves to us and say, okay, you're smart enough to be in our club, you're idiots before.
Yeah, they'll have a red star.
Who knows? I will tell you, the Chinese are putting a lot of money in this picture. We had an international conference in Beijing 7 years ago, and it was very apparent that they had a plan and they were gonna keep funding it
Well,
for.
they're building their own space station, right?
They build their own space station. They actually have a rover that's on the far side of it. So, they've been successful. So we've landed, Russia has landed, China has landed, and India has landed. Those are the only countries.
Well, you can't be a dominant world power if you're not in space.
Yeah.
There's all.
Yes,
That's the way it is.
well, and you use the phrase weaponization of space. Military space, and that is a fact in the sense that our military relies on space assets, as do the others. And at some point in time, damaging your adversary's space asset is going to be a reality. Fortunately, we have not got that.
Currently in the news, of course, was the balloon that came across the United States. I woke up every morning to the lights of NORAD's parking lot because I was at Fort Carson in Colorado Springs. And I was told that they could trace anything, they could trace and know exact location of all the space junk and anything that was flying anywhere in the world from inside Cheyenne Mountain. You already know about the balloon before it got to us.
I was confused by the balloon because they also said that they didn't know about the fire balloons until the intelligence community told them that.
Yeah, it was 60,000 feet. I mean, they can track that.
Oh, yeah, yeah. And it's a confusing story to me.
And I'm assuming that one of the reasons we didn't bother shooting it down yet is we were too busy studying what it was communicating. And, you know, we were finding out what it was doing, and gathering intelligence on it. And probably wave jamming it so that the Chinese couldn't get the
That would be
intelligence.
my assumption too, is that it's, figure out what it's really doing.
I'm sure we saw it coming and I'm sure they were.
Because it's also
prepared.
not gonna be the last one you see of it too.
But with everyone going into space now, is there any kind of discussion about international rules or laws or guidelines or what you can do?
There's actually a huge field of space law. But the foundations of space law go back to the Apollo time. And what has changed now is when, like, the space treaties and all of those things were done in the 60s, the only people that were interested in space were nation states. So all of the law is written to nation states. Well, does Elon care about that? He's not a nation state. He probably says that he is, but that's one of the big issues with the law right now, is that how do you now open that up to commercial entities? Elon has this Starlink system that's like 6,000 tiny satellites in mid-Earth orbits. I call that debris. And that's, it's just, we have more and more of those kind of networks that are being proposed with thousands of satellites. And so who handles that debris monitoring job? The Space Force. We're not gonna take that. They're gonna do it and not tell us about it, right? But they don't want to have the job of being the international police to say, you can't be there, you have to be here kind of role.
And what do we do if somebody doesn't want to be in the treaty?
Well, so there are UN bodies, frankly, that still deal with all of that. It's called the Committee on Peaceful Uses of Outer Space. And the US has a big voice in it, but a lot of other countries have big voices in it too. There were a whole series of orbital debris type behaviors that have been agreed to in the past. Now, the United States just pushed an anti-satellite set of rules, and we'll see if Russia or China agree to anything. But we basically said, we'll start and say, we're not gonna do any of this, and we're gonna act to clean up this piece. And we challenge you to do this thing.
You guys launched the military shuttle at all, or how's that?
That's all handled as a separate Space Force deal. Boeing built that, it's kind of like a third scale model of shuttle. It's been hugely successful. It's launched by a group called United Launch Alliance as the Atlas Centaur, and it has spent probably like 2 years.
It doesn't use any of your rockets.
No. It comes back down now. They want to do a bigger version of it. They could easily look at space launches.
It was up there for like almost a year and a half.
Oh, it's been over, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's been really amazing. And then lands Florida, and gets hauled into the processing building, and you know, sometime later it pops back out on top of an Atlas Centaur and goes down. It's been pretty successful.
It's pretty amazing, 60 years ago, when I was a little kid watching them blast off rockets on TV, how far they've advanced now is amazing how they were able to do that back then with all the. You can see how things have changed. I thought, how were they even able to do that?
Well, it's, yeah, I mean, well, it was money, but still, just understanding the physics of it all. Lots of rockets blew up before, well, put people on it. Although I think, they only had a couple successful launches of the Atlas before they put it on it. So it was still a pretty dicey proposition in those years.
Did you have to refurbish the crawler, or was that good to go?
We did have to refurbish quite a bit, actually. You know, even to the big treads on the base of the crawler, so that's what the Kennedy folks have been doing the last several years, is doing the crawler, doing new workstations in the VAB, doing a whole new pad, basically, you know, what they call a clean pad, we shuttle at.
Is it crushed shells that thing runs on, or what is it on? The base, the road base?
It's a special stone, it's not crushed shells, but it's a special size stone, and, you know, the whole crawler way is built up of, you know, several layers of different types of stone and gravel to hold the weight of that, because, yeah, when it's rolling out there, it's, you know, it's on the order of 8 million pounds.
It's funny to watch how slow it goes.
Yeah. Yeah, the joke about it, because
Is it really?
we use the beat pad, we have to take a turn, and they talk about taking the hairpin turn and get it out to the pad, so. In fact, watching it roll out, it was only because it was close to the building that I could really see it was rolling out. All of a sudden, it's under the doors, it's out of the doors.
Is it diesel or is it gas?
It is decent. Well, it's fun. All set?
Very good.
Very good.
All right. Well, my sisters.